Okay, so good morning and welcome to Helsinki and to this very intense week, and welcome to the international research data community contributing to EOSC Event, which is the first of a series of events as part of the EOSC Stakeholder Forum. I'm Sara Garavelli from Trusted Services. I'm part of the EOSC Secretariat project, which is the Horizon 2020 project supporting the EOSC governance. And I'm also the coordinator of the RDA Europe 4 project, which is the European chapter of the Research Data Alliance initiative. And this is why today I'm particularly very proud to see this room full for this event, where we want to provide the voices to the international research data community on the European Open Science Cloud, early achievements and future plans. If you're curious to know who's sitting close to you being compliant with the GDPR, I have some statistics about the participants. So we have around more than 200 registered members. We have an excellent gender balance, and more than 60% of the participants belongs to the research and academia sector, and we also have a good participation from the government and public administration. In terms of geographical breakdown, we have 33 countries represented from all over the world. And among the participants, there are representatives from the EOSC Executive Board, the Governance Board, and also RDA members. If we look at the topics, the interest in the breakout sessions, and the topics of the breakout sessions reflects the topics of the EOSC working groups, you can see that there is a high interest in the FAIR topic with the 35%, and then there is a good balance for all the others: architecture, landscape, rules of participation, and sustainability. The morning session will be also live streamed, so I invite also the people in remote to follow the event and to contribute to the event via Slido. So this link is available on the slides that will be made available on the EOSC Secretariat website, but it's also available already on the website. And I invite also the participants in the room to use this link to post your questions to the panelists. And then for those that are social media addicted, we have an hashtag for today, which is EOSC@RDA. And these are the handles that you can use for today's event. Okay, before introducing the first speaker, I just want to thank the EOSC Secretariat project, the Research Data Alliance, the EOSC Executive Board that spent a lot of effort in organizing this event, and I want to thank the local host for this wonderful venue. Okay, so we can start with the agenda of today. The first speaker is Hans-Josef Linkens, the chair of the Governance Board and German Federal Ministry of Education and Research. Hans-Josef, please.
This one, thank you. Yes, thank you, Sarah. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I have been asked today as one of the co-chairs and as a member state representative. In this capacity, I will give you an overview over the responsibilities, tasks, and current discussions in the governance board. However, this is not the only role I have today. I am here as well to listen to the ideas and to the concerns of the scientific community and to your input. EOSC is not a top-down project invented by the European Commission or by the member states, but it is really inclusive and is made to serve science, to bring best results from data which are available. The European Science Cloud, therefore, is inclusive, and it is built according to the needs of scientists, and it should help us all to make the best use of scientific data. And the Governance Board, therefore, is a body between decision-making on the one hand and coordination. We decide about the next steps, yes, which should be taken, and most important, we decide about the post-2020 structure. But to do this, we are dependent on the expertise of the research data community and other parties involved, so we can coordinate the different interests in the best way. So just a brief, some words concerning the EOSC vision. I'm not going to present to you about the EOSC in detail and the values. You all know that. And in connection with the EOSC, the metaphor of an elephant is used quite frequently. An elephant that is described very differently by different blind people. You probably heard that metaphor before. So I'm just highlighting two perspectives from my point of view. And the first point is the EOSC vision. From a political side, it's important that there is a certain promise, a hope, a prospect that has been taken up and welcomed in the political arena. It is the vision that EOSC will enhance the exchange of data and services across borders, but not only across borders, also across disciplines and across institutions. And this is, from a political perspective, really thrilling because it promises a great potential for innovation. And it bundles the digital single market for 1.7 million researchers from publicly funded research in Europe and for the European economy as well. The second point I want to highlight is that EOSC is a federated infrastructure. It is based on the existing infrastructure, and it focuses on research need, and it is community-driven and inclusive. This, of course, has been a debate, but it's now absolutely what is everyone agreeing to, and of course, it's the only way to do it, because we want to make use of the existing structures and of the existing knowledge. But it is also clear that this makes it more complex in terms of governance. A very brief overview over the governance structure, which reflects this situation and combines different aspects, is here given in the overview, and you probably know that. There is the governance board, which reviews and decides, and I will come back to this in a minute. And there is the executive board. The executive board is the working body. It prepares and elaborates proposals, and there will be a lot of debate today on the work of the working groups from the executive board today. And there is a stakeholder forum. This is one form to get input and feedback, and sometimes it's said that the stakeholder forum is called a sort of sounding body. It's not the only sounding body. We are also keen on your interest, but it's one of the existing feedback structures within the governance structure. Finally, not to forget the EOSC Secretariat, which makes things running. So, going to the governance board mandate. The Governance Board is formally a working group of the Horizon 2020 Strategic Program Committee, and therefore it will end at the end of next year because it's within the framework Horizon 2020. The members of the Governance Board are the representatives from member states, associated countries, and from the European Commission, and this will ensure effective supervision of the EOSC implementation. But what's more, and very important to me, is that this ensures to bring in the member states' perspective, because there are very special features, there is a big variability, there are many specific characteristics in the landscape. There is a big diversity in financing and organizational issues, and those must be taken into account if the EOSC is to be a success. So the governance board very much sees itself as bringing in, as ensuring the different structure, the diversity of the European landscape, not in terms of science, this is you, but in terms of organizational and financing structure. So the governance board is, because it's responsible for the financing and setting up of the national structures. So the governance board is, of course, the deciding body. It decides about the post-2020 structure of the EOSC and about the strategic orientation. But it was important for the governance board to be in a very close contact with the executive board, because we are very well aware that the work is done in the executive board. The work in this sense, they do the essential work of making proposal, how the EOSC should be run, what the architecture is, and all that. We will talk about this today in more detail. The executive board is, so to say, the creator of the future structure. And this is precisely why it is so important for the governance board to be in a very close exchange to ensure that the diversity of the member states is brought to the discussions in the working groups and the executive board as early as possible. And this is, for instance, why the governance board endorses the mandates of the working groups. It's not a question of control, it's a question of very close interlinkage and of exchange and bringing in the diversity of the structures in Europe. Again, the fundamental concern of the governance board is that the elaboration of the post-2020 structure of EOSC must reflect the diversity of national structures. And it must take into account national possibilities and requirements, also in terms of funding. Following precisely this logic and taking into account the timetable, which is quite tight and ambitious, the governance board has created the instrument of subgroups. Subgroups from the governance board, working groups from the executive board, so one can distinguish one from the other. The subgroups from the governance board do not prejudge decisions, but they want to prepare them. They do not duplicate the work of the working groups. They are open to all member states, and there must be a certain balance between the countries in order to reflect the diversity of the European landscape. And these requirements are precisely laid down in some principles which are shown on this slide. In concrete, several subgroups were initiated. However, there is a fluent process for the subgroups, and there are further subgroups which are going to be created. So don't overestimate the structure of the subgroups. More important is what is discussed in the governance board. But just to give an example, about these three subgroups which have been initially founded. The first one is focusing on compatibility, of course, of EOSC with the national structures, of course. However, the focus of this subgroups is changing and is more focusing on strategic partnerships. I will come back to this in 2 slides from now. And the second subgroups is dealing with the regulatory framework, which is of course one of the core competence of the governance board, as we are representatives mostly from ministries or from bodies from the member states. And the third subgroup is dealing with the question of long-term sustainable use of data. Again, the debates are most important, and I will show you the debates now in 2 slides. My message here for this slide is simply the subgroups are underlining the importance and the urgency of the discussion and show the strategic approach of the governance board. The next slide is showing the Executive Board Working Group, but I'm not going to talk about this because we have a lot of time to go in depth to this discussion and debate today. More important, and this is my second last slide, more important is more important is the current discussion of the Governance Board. I would, from a personal point, that's not an official statement, but from my personal point of view, there are two important debates, and I want to highlight them. One debate is about the Strawman report, which focuses in particular on the question of core elements and marketplace. A central question will be which offers and which services become available at which conditions. A marketplace is a very good instrument in order to organize offers and demands. However, it must be ensured that there are no hurdles and it makes it not difficult to use those data, repositories, and services which are existing. Also, fees and costs is a good idea, and we have to debate on this within the business models. However, we should be very careful that it does not prevent scientists from using these services, and the costs and the implementations should not have a prohibited effect. And I think that will be an interesting debate when we come back to discussing business models. And the second aspect, different from that, in the discussion of the Governance Board is the discussion about partnerships. You know, there is a debate about partnerships, maybe co-programmed or co-funded, but anyway, about strategic partnerships. And these partnerships are discussed between the member states and between the Commission. And the exciting question is whether this instrument will be agreed in the next framework program and whether EOSC might be an excellent example or a very concrete example for one strategic partnership. I think my personal view is that a partnership is a very good instrument because it makes it possible that we can bring together various contributions and can combine them with a clear common objective. But it seems also very important to me that it should be clear who makes which contributions. I think it will be very important to have also contributions to make overarching activities possible. Only if there are different contributions from the main member states, also from the scientific communities with the internal structures, and resources also from the European side. Only that will make it possible to give a real added value and to bring different aspects, different services and data repositories from the national side together on a European level. And this is why I am pleased that I am able to discuss with you about the requirements, the expectations, but also about the input and the added value of the EOSC. And always the aim is to build EOSC together. That's the most important point. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for a couple of questions, if there are questions. No questions, you were super clear. Okay, so I'm going to call the next speaker on stage, which is Karel Leuben from the CSER and chair of the EOSC Executive Board.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everybody. The difference between the Executive Board and the Governance Board being that the Executive Board has to push and pull and the Governance Board has to approve. And therefore we decided to move to 16 by 9 or 9 by 16 slides from the 3 by 4 slides which are still used by the Governance Board. But for the rest they are the same. I I'm trying to give you some overview of the next steps we're working on, because what we're actually doing and what has been done will be discussed by the panel later on with the different working groups. If we look back a little bit, then we've seen that the first phase of EOSC has been a number of projects already started before the Executive Board and Governance Board were in existence, and these different projects were aimed at the different lines developed at the roadmap for EOSC, in the direction of data, in the direction of services, in the direction of architecture, access, rules, and governance. These were the 6 lines which were used in order to get, with these projects, things moving. If we look at what is happening at this period in between 2019, beginning of 2019, and the end of 2020, we have the Executive Board and the Governance Board and the working groups. We have a governance structure. I'm sure you've seen pictures of that. I'm not going to explain that, but the governance structure has as a task to steer the initial implementation, to involve as much as possible the research and innovation community. Well, it's good to see all of you here, so many people here, because this is one of the events where we want to get your involvement and where we want to talk to the stakeholders and to make the transition to the next stage, as Frans Josef clearly explained. Activities up to date, more than 30 active EOSC-related projects. The strategic implementation plan, you can find it on the website, has been published. The work plan has been drafted, it says here, but in the meantime it's been finished and published as well. You can also find it on the website. We have 5, and I say 5+ working groups, because we're discussing a new working group on skills, and next Friday we will also have an initial discussion on a task force for international outreach, and by international, this case, we mean outside of Europe, of course. There have been the consultation days where many of these projects, more than 30, came together. The Commission asked these projects to talk to each other in order to further concentrate the effort and to interact. Well, today and the next coming of days, we have the RDA meetings here, the event, and in next month there will be a symposium in Budapest. Some of the things that are happening at the moment. The work plan, I already mentioned it, recently published, and I think these are the main headlines out of that work plan, and behind it I have given the indication of the working groups that are most likely to do most of the work in that domain. So the aim is to get in the period up till the end of 2020 to an agreed and tested rules, set of rules of participation. Under what conditions can what parties participate in this venture? Then the analysis of the existing infrastructures and policies is going to be done by the working group on landscape, but also the sustainability working group has to look at that because it has a lot of influence on the sustainability. The sustainability working group is working on a model for financing. Well, you've heard the word partnership, I'll come back to that in a minute, on a, let's say, possible legal entity, as was mentioned by Frans Josef in the Stroman report, and on the initial services that will be there. And that is an important step because this, what we call minimal federating core we would like to start in this period, is going to be the nucleus of where from the rest of the EOSC ecosystem, as I call it, will be formed. I distinguish between, let's say, EOSC between parentheses being this legal entity and their activities, I'll come back to that in a minute, and the EOSC ecosystem, because if you are a repository somewhere in Europe and you link up to EOSC, are you then EOSC? No, you're still the repository, but you're part of EOSC. So, in my view, you're part of the EOSC ecosystem. That's why I introduced that word to make it clear. The initial set of data and services, I already mentioned it by the architecture group, and the EOSC interoperability framework, a very important thing, because the whole aim for me in the long run, and I'm thinking in, let's say, 20 years' time, will be that we can combine every data set of every researcher that is available with any other data set of any other researcher that is also available. Now, this is theory, of course, and many of these combinations will not be useful. But it's not theory in a sense that it's not possible, and many of these combinations we cannot make nowadays are very useful. So in my view, in the long run, the aim is not only that researchers can find data sets that are relevant for them, preferably as easy as they can find Dipoli on the map. If they take Google Maps, they say Dipoli, Helsinki, they're here in a split second. So why can we not find a data set of a colleague researcher also in a split second? Then this interoperability is, of course, to a large extent already created with respect to the e-infrastructure. So the interoperability in the internet and in the hardware and the software is further developed than the interoperability of data itself. And this is a tough job we're working on very hard. We is not we as the executive board or we as the working group. We is the community at large, which is doing a lot of work here. Then a persistent identifier policy has to be created. All these data sets and the metadata sets need identifiers, of course, and the metrics for fair data and repository certification. The issues in this transition period, according to me, are the business model or the financing of the thing and the structure and the legal entity. This EOSC between parentheses, the boundary conditions, I'll come back to that in a minute, and Frans Jozef mentioned quite a lot of them already. The data services infrastructures in the countries. No, we're not going to model all these data services infrastructures in all these countries. It's impossible, and we don't want to, but we have to look at that, and we can inspire each other with the different structures that exist in the different countries. I'll come back to that a little bit later as well. And then, what will be the core activities of this core minimum federating unit? And the implementation deadline, the implementation timeline, sorry, is mostly given by the Commission at this time, because we're still working on the Horizon 2020 program and moving up to the Horizon Europe program that is deciding large parts of the timeline. What boundary conditions do I mean, and what boundary conditions can you think of? This is a set, I think, of relevant boundary conditions. There may be more, and we can argue on these boundary conditions. We are arguing now and then on these boundary conditions, but more or less, these boundary conditions are agreed on. Core funding is needed, also from the European Commission. Otherwise, this is not going to fly. In the long run, it may be different, but for the next, let's say, couple of years, 7 to 10 years, this is essential. And therefore, I'll talk about the partnership in a second. Inclusiveness for all the stakeholders. So people have to feel that they are part of this system, that they are part of the ecosystem. And important there is that we all work according to the same core principles. We have a core purpose which we share. And if we don't have a core purpose of everybody joining the ecosystem, again, it's not going to work, because somebody's working that direction and somebody else will work in that direction. We have to realize that the countries have different structures. We're not going to change these structures in the countries, it's impossible, so we'll have to live with these structures, and we have to be able to combine and link up to these structures. We see this as inclusive as possible. Hans Jozef already mentioned this, and self-inclusivity, and by that is meant if you comply with all the rules of participation, it should be a strange thing if you're not going to be part of the ecosystem. So you could, as an organization, already look beforehand whether you can or will be part of the ecosystem, most likely. Suppose you say, I'm not going to be involved in making the data as fair as possible. I can tell you, you're not very welcome in the EOSC system, because this is one of the essential boundary conditions. The whole system should, of course, be hardware agnostic, not relating on a certain type of hardware, and it should focus, as I just included in my previous statement, on fair data and the services that go with that. Mentioned by Hans Jozef, there are two types of partnerships that could be considered. According to me, and based on what I've read and what I've heard from the experts on this, I think the co-programming partnership is the very most likely partnership we should aim for. But whatever we aim for, we should aim for one of them, because if we are not in the list of possible partnerships with the EOSC, we cannot even set up a partnership, and we have to wait until a possible second round. So I think it's essential that we strive towards being on that list, and then we have next year to work it out and still pull it back if we don't think it's useful, or if we cannot make it, or if we are not admitted. Two examples, and a lot of people fell over me when I presented these slides at other occasions. These are just examples. This is not saying these are the organizations that are going to do it, but one example is an organization that is a legal entity, and the other example is an organization that is not a legal entity, showing the spectrum of organizations we have doing similar things. In some cases, it's about hardware and connections. In other cases, it's about, let's say, a system and maintaining a system. And EOSC, again, is a different animal, but these are, let's say, organizations that could inspire us in finding the right type of organization for EOSC. I see EOSC between parentheses, and now I'm talking about this minimal federating core as a twin, sister or brother, it's up to you, of the e-infrastructures. The e-infrastructure organizations in the countries and in Europe are the ones that offer computing power, that offer connection services, and I think that the EOSC between parentheses should complement to that by offering the services for data and the interoperability. E-infrastructures without data are useless. Data without e-infrastructures do not work. So this is an essential combination we have to make, and it's a very essential interaction we have to form. Possible core functions for this minimal federating core. Develop and govern the federating structure, of course, that is existing, then manage the compliance framework coming from the rules of participation, manage trusted certification, the EOSC trademarks, not implement, that's the wrong word here, but let's say, again, manage the fact that PID policies needs to be implemented. And all these things, if it says manage, does not necessarily mean this organization is going to do the managing themselves. It can also be outsourced, but it has to be done and it has to be tied together in this organization, which we call the minimal federating core. Developing the outreach to stakeholders, contribute, of course, to the Horizon Europe policy if we want to, let's say, be in a partnership, and monitor services and transactions. Again, this is sort of what I see as a sort of minimum set that is needed for this legal entity, but it could be more than that. Last slide, items to consider for the next future. Is this business model, is the legal entity, how, when, what? Is the data services infrastructures in the countries help each other? We had a very fruitful meeting yesterday in a town just north of here, Tikula-Lira, well, difficult name, but in the University of Applied Sciences, Laurea, where 21 countries sort of said, we want to join a team of countries where we link up our organization of the open science activities in our country, the coordination of the open science activity in our countries. We can learn from each other. But basically, this was the message. Twinning structures in as well the EU as in the countries. So in the Netherlands, for example, I'm striving that we also get a similar twinning structure as I've just described between the e-infrastructures and the EOSC between parentheses. Core activities to be implemented and, of course, within the proper timeline. I'm sure if we do all of that, we have reached at least a stage at the end of 2020 where we can say to the countries, this is what we think is a viable structure to maintain together with the Commission for the next years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karel. So as we are running 10 minutes late, I would like you to keep your questions for Karel for the panel after the break. That will be completely focused on the working groups and the EOSC Executive Board. Thanks, Karel. So now we can start then with the first panel of the day, which is the panel with representatives of Open Science Data Commons initiatives in Africa, Australia, Canada, Europe, and Japan. And therefore, I would like to introduce the moderator of the panel, who is Hilary Hanao, Secretary General of the Research Data Alliance.
Thank you, Sarah. I shall move up here. Good morning. So, I think you can move that down. So, before I give my little introduction, I'd like to invite the panelists to come up this morning to address you. So, please come up and I will introduce you as we go. So the first is Jill Ben, who is the University Librarian from the University of Western Australia. Then we have Mark Leggett, who is the Executive Director of Research Data Canada and Canary. Kostas Glinos, the Head of Unit for Open Science at the Directorate General for Research and Innovation at the European Commission. Omo Oaya, got it right? The Chief Strategy Officer of the West and Central African Research and Education Network. Andreas Weisbach, the Head of Unit for E-Infrastructures and Science Cloud at the European Commission, the Directorate General for Communications, Networks, Content and Technology. And last but not least, Yashiro Murayama, who is the Research Executive Director of the Big Data Integration Research Center at the National Institute of Information and Communication Technologies from Japan. So we just heard about the status and the next steps in Europe and how the European Open Science Cloud is shaping up and developing. We are delighted as the Research Data Alliance to be collaborating with the European Open Science Cloud Secretariat, the Governance Board and the Executive Board for organising this event to try and understand how the international perspective and international activities that are taking place can support and learn, of course, from what's taking place in Europe, but also, more specifically, 3 different areas where I hope that the Research Data Alliance can provide support. My expectation from today and the future would be that we understand what activities the groups are discussing in the Research Data Alliance that could be of use to the Open Science Cloud. What outputs, concrete outputs, some of which, by the way, are standards in Europe, can be useful in the implementation of this roadmap? And then what about the challenges and the areas that are still not covered? And how can RDA, with the processes and the mechanisms and the bottom-up consensus building and international activities that go on, how we can support and help in the implementation? I would like to say one thing. I would like to thank Catherine Stover, who I think is following us on streaming. Catherine has been instrumental in shaping the agenda of this program. I'm sorry she's not with us, but I'm happy to know that she's following us. Catherine is from Géant and the Vice Chair of the Executive Board of the Open Science Cloud. So I have asked the panelists to give 3-minute overview, a little bit, just to speak a little on their status of activities in their region or country. And then I have some questions from the audience and some questions ready, and we'll go through the questions, and you can, of course, ask questions from the audience yourself. So I'm going to do it in alphabetical order of surname. So Jill, if you wouldn't mind coming and speaking to us about the Australian Research Data Commons.
So thank you, Hilary, and thanks to RDA and EOSC for inviting us to speak at this event. I was told I had 5 minutes to give an overview of what's happening in Australia, to highlight some main data opportunities and challenges, and to talk about the importance of international collaboration. So hopefully I can quickly get through this. So I wanted to start by mentioning that the majority of work that's happening in Australia at the moment is being led by the Australian Research Data Commons. And they're a fabulous organisation that's providing excellent leadership, and I know a number of the staff from the ARDC are here with us this morning. So this has been funded under the Australian Government National Research Infrastructure for Australia initiative. And it's really meant to underpin a lot of national investment in a range of different kinds of infrastructure investment, which relate from everything from oceans observatory, astronomy, right through to microscopy. So the ARDC is really about bringing together people, skills, infrastructure, storage, compute, to enable Australia to undertake world-class research. So the ARDC is relatively new and relatively not so new. It was established by the Australian Government in July 2018, but incorporated as a company just in May this year. But it's not so new because, of course, it's based on organisations that may be familiar to you, the Australian National Data Service, ANZ, the National E-Research Collaborative Tools and Resources, NECTA, and the Research Data Services, RDS. You can see in Australia we like acronyms as well. So the ARDC has a budget of $185 million, which is about 114 million euro over the next 4 years. And it's really important for institutions like my own, the University of Western Australia. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about some of the data opportunities and challenges using the 5 strategic themes of the ARDC. So the first is about coordination and coherence, and I think this is just as important at the international level as it is within Australia. So there's lots of different bodies providing lots of different services, and sometimes from a researcher perspective I'm reminded of how confusing that is. So coordination and coherence in our sector is critically important, and that's one of the first priorities of the ARDC. The next is about people and policy, and this recognises that great research data infrastructure doesn't just come from storage and compute. There's a lot of social and cultural and organisational challenges that need to be addressed for effective digital infrastructures. And of course, libraries play such a significant role in that change at an institutional level, and the ARDC is partnering with the Council of Australian University Librarians in this regard. The next is about data and services. This is about really maximising the value of Australia's data assets, ensuring that they're reusable and fair. Software and platforms is recognising the complexity of the environment that we're working within and the need for these trusted platforms. And of course, storage and compute is important for infrastructure underlying it all as well. So I wanted to just finish, I was asked to talk about why I think international collaboration and cooperation is important. And it's pretty, at a basic level, our research is international, so international collaboration for us is important as well. But I wanted to tell you a bit of an anecdote. So we are at the moment at my university undertaking a piece of research about the implementation of a research data strategy. We were fortunate that our university decided that our new vision has a strategic priority to be a trusted source of open research. And so the library has been charged with really putting in some infrastructure to service this. And of course, we've started by interviewing researchers and asking them what their needs are. And in an interview recently, a researcher talked about that he can't get access to his colleagues' data sets. He doesn't know where to find them. And then we asked him, well, what would you do with the data set if you got access to it? And he said, well, I don't really trust that data set, so I'm not sure I would use it. So if that's happening at an institutional level, just within one department, what's happening across a country, a region, internationally? What research is being wasted because we haven't developed the trusted repositories? We're not working together. And as information professionals, I think we have a key responsibility to work collaboratively and help solve some of the world's greatest challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jill. You brought up the big trust word, which I think is very important. Kostas Klinos, go ahead. You may stay. You don't have to go. Yes, stay. Yes.
Good morning to everybody. So EOSC has been presented this morning from both the chair of the governing board and the chair of the executive board. So I will not talk about EOSC specifically. I'll just make 3 points. One is about our overall policy in Europe for open science, because this is what is the framework for EOSC. In this open science policy, we aim at we're looking at the research system as a whole, and we try to make it more efficient, more performant, more creative, and to improve the relation between society and science, society and the research system. And we believe we can do this by opening up the system. So EOSC is part of this, is a contributor to this. There are several other parts, like our open access policy to publications, the and several other measures that deal with the integrity of science, for example, ethics of science, with citizen science, and the fair data. There is another part of European Union policy, which is the digital single market, to which also the EOS contributes, and to which my colleague Andreas will probably say a few words later on. The second point is about, since this international panel is about the international dimension. So problems, as we all know, are the same everywhere in the world. A large amount of data, they say more than 50%, coming out of experiments are not reproducible. Publications, many publications, in some cases, as much as 85% are not reproducible. A lot of data are not accessible to others. They stay in the sticks or in the computers of the scientists. A lot of the repositories are not reliable or certified. There are many issues, many problems, and a lot of the data are not interoperable among themselves, especially if they come from different areas of research that may be very related, but still we cannot interoperate. This is one of the challenges, for example, that RDA has been called on to solve. So the challenges are largely the same, and of course, somebody doing research in Europe in a certain area wants to have access to data wherever in the world. It's not going to limit themselves to the geographic area of Europe or whatever other area. Therefore, international cooperation in data and in infrastructures for data is really necessary, coming out from the global nature of science. We have been supporting a number of initiatives over the last 10 years, including initiatives that are represented here, like RDA, GoFair. We have been working with CoData, with G7, with the OECD, and so on, in many initiatives to make data accessible and interoperable across countries. We have a number of principles, so we would like to see, in particular, reciprocity on a global level. In other words, we would like to see that to the extent that we are open and we provide access, and this is not only about, in particular, about data, of course, this is also about any other thing, including infrastructures or publications. So to the extent that we provide access globally, we would like to see others providing access globally. This is a fundamental principle that will go, will also be factored in our future framework program. And this is my third point, and last one, which is about walking the talk. I don't know how many people from here today are funding agencies or relate to rules for funding, but one thing is to help build infrastructures and develop data interoperability on a global level like EOSC does. But on the other hand, those that are funding the public research worldwide need to set rules that are in accordance with the discourse that we are giving. And this is what we are trying now to do at the European Commission level, because we are designing the rules for the next framework program, Horizon Europe, that is due to start at the end of next year and will go on for 7 years. So we would like to have fair data as a strong recommendation or obligation even. We would like to have the rule as open as possible, as closed as necessary for all research data that are being produced in the program. We would like to introduce the notion of, to have the notion of trusted repositories and assure somehow that the data will be placed in repositories where they can be found and they are trusted to exist in the long term. So, in short, all kinds of rules that walk the talk of what we're talking about here in EOSC, and we would be very interested in talking to other funders worldwide to compare approaches and to see that we are all going the same direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Kostas. Okay. So, yeah, big points there again, reciprocity and, of course, walking the talk. And I think there are some questions around those sort of things and trying to ensure the openness and the building, as we say, while we all build, that they will at one point eventually be able to meet up. Mark Leggett, Executive Director or DC.
Thanks, Hillary.
You're up next.
My first comment is I was up all night watching the Canadian election, and in typical Canadian fashion, not much interesting happened. So I'm not quite sure why I stayed up all night, but I think the main comments I would like to make are related to the how similar the Canadian ecosystem is to our colleagues in Australia and with the project EOSC. Those are the two projects that I follow quite closely. Recent events in Canada included the organization, the federal organization in Canada that funds pretty much all things research, including our funding agencies and research infrastructure organizations, has decided to create a new national organization, which is currently called the New Organization. Doesn't yet have a name. And that organization is intended to sit alongside an existing organization called Canary, which is the one that funds me in Research Data Canada. And Canary will look after the kind of the foundational network, cybersecurity, and those kind of related components. And the new organization will take responsibility for high-performance computing, research data management, research software, and storage. So a lot of what's happening in Canada right now is, to a large degree, looking to our colleagues internationally to see what best practices are being adopted in the national context. Canada very much mirrors the European Union, just at a different level. Instead of nation states working together to build a federated system that surfaces across the EU, the provinces in Canada and the institutions within those provinces are building federated infrastructure along with national organizations like mine to surface nationally. The intentions and the goals are pretty much exactly the same. And for that reason, one of the interesting opportunities that I look to is how we can engage with the EOSC community, both to ensure the vision that Carol outlined in terms of a researcher being able to find a data set and related research objects with a quick and simple search. And that, of course, should happen across the research community globally. So our interest is in ideally matching the approach, and as I learn more and more about the EOSC approach, I find that it does in fact mirror a lot of the kinds of things that we're doing in Canada. Just as a couple of, so the new organization will kind of be ready to carry out its mandate in 12 to 18 months. And in that transitional period, funding is flowing to organizations that are intended to kind of fold into or merge into or facilitate the efforts of this new organization. So two examples in the data management context. One of the projects in Canada out of the academic library community is called Carl Portage. And Portage recently received funding to continue to build its network of experts and also to continue to enhance and bring to an operational capacity national infrastructures like the Federated Research Data Repository and the Dataverse North instance, which is a national network of Dataverse instances. Another example was an open call for research data management projects to enhance existing platforms to increase interoperability between multiple platforms and repositories and surface at a national level with adherence to the FAIR principles. So that competitive funding call is designed primarily not to build new infrastructures, but to enhance existing infrastructures and ensure their interoperability nationally. And ultimately, of course, the goal would be to plug those kinds of efforts into international efforts like EOSC. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today and continuing to define and engage with projects like EOSC from the Canadian interest.
Thanks, Mark. Very good. Next is Moriyama-san. We're doing it in alphabetical order of surname. Moriyama has a couple of slides. Do you want to come up and show them? Ooh.
Okay, thank you. Can I start?
Oh, please, do.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my name is Yasuhiro Murayama from Japan. Yeah, so it's very much honor for me to be standing here today, and thank you very much for that. And I'd like to start my speech with the showing some science policy, a governmental science policy issue here. I'm showing this G7 view graph. This is one of the international government coordination body. And this has been very much influential to the Japanese government and Japanese national university policies and Japanese research communities so far. And the epoch making for us was G7 science ministers meeting in 2016, hosted by Japan, and the Japanese government proposed their open science session there, and I was invited there, and it was an honor to me too. And the G7 group made an open science working group there. And the European Union and Japan are co-chair for that. That's and the Japanese science community is not really the world-leading open science community, but this is a kind of the expression that Japan is trying to work for open science, and this is a starting point for us. And so since then, we have been working for making policy guidelines, trying to implement the data management plan as much as possible, some stimulating the communities, etc. And the important issue, another issue, are also here the G7 in 2017 Italy. We had agreement there that in G7 countries should promote the rewards and incentives of the research community, research scientists, including the researcher career research evaluation there. Also, the globally interoperable data infrastructure is a key issue also. And I'm not going into the details of this view graph. I would like to just show the Cabinet Office has been a main body for Japanese community to promote open science in the national landscape, and we have been making some national open science principle report and guidelines for data policy and the trusted data repository. It's not certification, but yeah, I have been working for all of them, and it was successful to involve a core trust seal requirement too in the national guideline. And so we are trying to be aligned to the international works as much as possible. And in another aspect, Science Council Japan is scholars community, and at first they were not very much positive for that, but now they are running the Open Science Committee in the council, and also I'm a member of the committee, and they are interacting with the government to optimize a strategy for open science in the Japanese landscape. And this view graph shows the, I'm sorry, the view graph is NII, so-called NII Research Data Cloud. This is a very busy view graph, and you can see that this triangle that's in research data management platform and publication platform and discovery platform. Those are three focuses of the system, and they are trying to have make it interoperable as much as possible. They are working with the Center for Open Science for the software middleware tools, and this institute is has a majority of the computer scientists, and now they are making this kind of computer infrastructure. And they are also, I believe that they are working with the European Open Science Cloud people to have a partnership. And on the other hand, we have another future issue for the storage resources and repository workflow designs, how to engage the communities. Those are, I believe, the common challenges for the international community. But the Japanese scientists are trying to look at these issues now, but majorities are still far from this kind of the open science principle, research data sharing principles. That's I are very much happy to be there as one of the representatives from Asia, and I hope that we could be aligned to you in future work. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mariama. So, thank you, Mariama. It's a rather complex diagram that you have there. But I was very pleased to see the Core Trust Seal, if I may, because, of course, I'm very proud, we're very proud of the Core Trust Seal, which is a certification, and Kostas mentioned certification before, and the Core Trust Seal comes from the Research Data Alliance. And one of the wonderful stories I like about the Core Trust Seal is that it reduced the number of standards in the world by 1, which is also an important achievement. We do need standards, but sometimes it's nice to reduce them. So, Omo, would you like to give us some insights from West and Central Africa?
I intend to do it for all of Africa, so it's enough.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, even better.
So yeah, the story is slightly different for us. So we've just, 10 years ago, a decade ago, we had problems with sort of connecting our researchers in Africa to international collaborations. At the time, e-infrastructures were the real issue. We had connectivity problems. But to a large extent, the Africa Connect program that the European Commission supports has addressed that to some extent. There's still a lot of work to be done. But in the last 3 years, because of some parallel projects, again, the European Commission supported, that were introducing digital infrastructures for researchers in the space, we got exposed to open science. And so in those projects, we sort of realized that we had to sort of deploy more open access repositories in the region. And what that sort of stimulated was collaborations between the 3 regional African NRENs. The way the regional RENs are in Africa, we've got 3 RENs, one in West and Central Africa that I work for, one in South and East Africa, and one in North Africa. So we basically, these 3 regional entities cover the research networks in Africa. So what had happened after those projects was that, our collaboration with Open Air, which is European, NII from Japan, very instrumentally the Confederation of Open Access Repositories, which is an international organization, sort of came together to get librarians and NRENs and other researchers in a sort of community to work towards more pervasive open access and open science. So that was the first initiative. So what that did was to get, the community in the 3 different regions together in a series of activities. So we managed to build a community there. Now, within the Africa Connect program, we're in the 3rd iteration. And in this iteration, we're sort of inverting the priorities a little bit. Before now, it was connectivity mostly. What I liked is the presentation, which sort of put the infrastructure and the data together. That became pretty obvious to us as well, and that's the current focus. So in this iteration of the project, we're going to be looking at, providing fair, compliant repositories as the foundation of open science. But there's also another initiative, the African Open Science Platform, which comes out of South Africa. It's a collaboration between the International Council of Science and CoData, but it's funded by the South African government. The intent there as well is to sort of get a community across Africa and some sort of collaboration and governance framework. It's in very early stages, but we think that the combination of the African RENs and LIPSENS, this LIPSENS initiative that brings the librarians and the NRENs together, along with this sort of cooperation framework, we'll be able to start getting things in place. But the focus for us is getting as much fair compliant repositories in the system as a basis, building the community, bringing the community together, because we think the services in Africa would need to be contextual. The problems are the same, but they sort of manifest differently in different regions. So there's another question I was supposed to talk about. Yes, and I think the whole idea about international collaboration is pretty obvious. We're building, in the case of the regional RENs, we're building infrastructure with based on standard components that have been used in Europe. We think openness benefits us more than most, and so we're very happy to be part of this, and we'll continue to be part of it.
Thank you very much, Omo. It's good. Oh, I don't know if you can hear me. Thank you. May I ask a question? You probably weren't prepared for this, but can I ask you a quick question before I move to one of this? What is your sort of user base in Africa? Because it must be pretty big. I'm wondering, is it like the European one, or?
In numbers or in diversity?
In numbers, well, I'm sure they're diverse.
I don't know.
Do you have any idea?
But if you think 55 countries, some pretty large ones like Nigeria with 200 million people.
So pretty complex. Right?
Yes. And then there's a whole lot of diversity, and even within regions. So Europe is a good example.
Indeed. And that's a great segue to the last but not least member of our panel this evening, or this morning, sorry. And I'm not even like in a different part of the world. I actually live in Europe. Andreas Weisbach. Andreas.
Thanks very much, Hilary. So as Kostas mentioned already, in the Commission we look at EOSC from two perspectives. One is the perspective of open science, and the other one is the perspective of the digital single market. And Kostas and our colleagues in DG RTD very much deal with open science, and in DG Connect we're more focused on the digital single market aspects. So I will make a few very brief points. The first one really relates to the overarching policy of the next Commission. Simply because we will have a change in the Commission now in the coming months, and in the planning of both of our financial programs, as well as in our political programming, I think the priorities of our new president will probably be the key factor against which anything that we do will be measured. There are really 3 or 4 key main priorities there, all of which actually I think relate to EOSC in a rather direct way. The first one is everything to do with green and sustainability. The second one is really the digitalization and the digital economy in Europe. The third one is economic development, and the fourth one I think is very relevant to here, which is Europe's place in the international setting. If we take digital and we look at where Europe would like to be in the international setting, then I think that our objective really is to become a global reference point and a best practice in terms of how digital spheres, let's say, are governed in a way that are open, that are trusted, that are transparent, and that are inclusive. I think that this really, from a digital single market point of view, is where Europe will aim to go, building on things like the GDPR or the Open Data Directive, also over the next 5 years. Now, coming to EOSC specifically, I would firstly actually very much like to thank our colleagues both in the governance board and in the executive board for the work that has been done. EOSC is an extremely complicated project, and I think for us it is not just a technical problem that we're facing. I think that it is also a very classical coordination problem, which is that there are such a large number of actors in EOSC that putting them together into a structure which is comprehensible, makes sense, and is operational is extremely tough. So the first thing about EOSC that I think is at the core of its problem, it's a very European problem, is a coordination question. The second question that we really have with regard to EOSC is I would say, the legal framework, which I think Hans-Josef was already mentioning. What we see is that in interlinking the fragmented landscape in Europe, the problems are not always technical. Actually, the problems are quite often legal. And I think that this is something which public authorities, the Commission and the Member States, by definition, should address. The third issue that for us is key with regard to EOSC is how do we use it as a vehicle to turn quality science, both in Europe and internationally, into maximization of its socioeconomic benefits. Europe very clearly still, in terms of quality verifiable science, I think it is still the world leader. But what we're really striving to do through using the digital tools at our disposal is to turn that into very concrete benefits. The fourth challenge that I see with EOSC is really operationalizing it. And when I mention operationalization, it really relates to what Karel was talking about, the core and the wider ecosystem. But first and foremost, I think that now EOSC was launched back in 2016 in the European Cloud Initiative. I think that we need to rather rapidly, within EOSC, make progress to a point where there are tangible benefits to the scientists themselves. Because at the moment we are financing over 30 projects in EOSC. They're all doing extremely valuable work. But where I think we now really have to focus on is making sure that the scientist, so the end user, really sees the tangible benefits from using EOSC. Then the fifth thing from the perspective of DG Connect, on which we are working at the moment, is creating a link in terms of our infrastructural basis between EOSC, HPC, so high-performance computing, and also the connectivity angle, which so far in the research community has largely been done through Jean. And the sixth issue for EOSC, I think, is the long-term commitment. In all the years that I've been working in the Commission, I think the one core thing that I have learned is that any user of anything wants predictability, they want planning certainty. And this is something that EOSC has to provide. EOSC should provide a perspective which is not just project by project, in a sense that a project lasts for 36 months, then it's over and that's it. But the perspective we have to provide is really counted in years, if not decades. And I think that the sustainability of EOSC has to provide that. And that brings me to the RDA, which is where we see that the RDA could provide, I think, a major contribution to what we do. The first one clearly is the whole international dimension of EOSC. This is obvious. You have, I think, an enormous amount of experience in that field, and as has been said before, science by definition is international. And open science in particular, in a way, if you look at what's going on in the world, is a very important marker, because I would like to say with confidence that the whole world is moving increasingly towards openness and inclusivity. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, and I think their science can really actually be a bridge towards protecting those values. The second role for RDA, I think, is everything to do with being user-driven and bottom-up, which is that once again, we have had quite a lot of talks about governance structures and various other things, but I want to come back to the scientist and the user itself, and I think that this is where both EOSC, but also at the international level, we have to display our value added. It is not just about structures, it is really about tangible benefits, and there I think your engagement and your experience can be quite valuable. The third point, I think, is not so much on the evolution, but rather just a comment on what you do. I would very much like to see the RDA in a certain way increase its visibility, because you do a lot of very, very good work, but when the outputs of that work come out, I'm not sure that you always get all the credit that you deserve for it. Then what on the Connect side, or the DG Connect side, I think as a fourth point, we see that the RDA could help us quite a lot in the implementation of the Open Data Directive. So we have research data now included in that, and we're in the process of constructing these common data spaces in a thematic level, and I think some of the problematics that you deal with in data could be extremely useful there. The fifth point for RDA relates to societal challenges as a whole. I know Kostas already told me there are a lot of points, but still relates to societal challenges, which is that we would very much, I think, like to see both science and EOSC increasingly used for our own public policy purposes. So not just a supply-side driven process, but a demand-side driven process whereby we take the outputs of the work that you do and we tangibly use them in policy making. And then, of course, the last point, I think, brings me back to the user and the scientist. In data-intensive science, what is called data wrangling, or trying to prepare the data for analysis that actually adds value, takes up, I think, 60 to 80% of the resources of the researchers, which obviously, by simplifying that, I think that we could end up in a situation where a lot of that time is used for things that actually provide a value added as opposed to just preparing it. And that's it, thank you.
So, thank you very much, Andres. Big shopping list for us in RDA, but I mean, I fully agree, and it's really good to hear, thank you, and for everybody, I hope, to all my community here, and to hear about, you know, the importance that you place on the Research Data Alliance and how we can tangibly help, because I think that's what we're here for. On the societal challenges, I will say one thing. We are experimenting at this plenary about, you know, how the RDA outputs can be, because they're very different and very vast, how they can be packaged in ways around different themes, and of course the Sustainable Development Goals are in there as well. But I think we think that would be a value also, because of course, yes, we have many outputs, but sometimes it's very difficult for the user, the potential user, to understand exactly how they could be packaged and put in. So I would like, there are some questions, but before I put them up, because we have only about 15 to 20 minutes for discussion, but there are a couple of questions, and I'm going to pick on one of them, if you don't mind, to start. I did say to my panel they'll give me the nod on the question that they would like to answer, so no one has to answer a question that they don't feel comfortable about. But there was a little discussion a bit about the legal framework, and we've talked a lot about openness, and we've talked a lot about international cooperation. So with all those ideas and all the interoperability, why are we still challenged, though, with jurisdictional issues around data assets? So, you know, and how could we overcome this? Is it, you know, have you any ideas, thoughts to give? Mark? Would you like to start?
Two things occur to me. I was a privacy officer for 20 years in previous career, and more often than not, privacy, of course, is very important. It's increasingly important as data becomes a key driver in the economy. So I think a big factor in the jurisdictional piece is privacy. Having said that, I believe that it's still today as it was when I was a privacy officer. Sometimes privacy is used as a bit of a red herring, as we say, and sometimes is put forward as an impediment when it needn't be. The other important factor, I think, is our funding models and the fact that our funding tends to be at the national level. EOSC is a great example of a multinational approach. In Canada, certainly it's difficult for funding that flows from our national funding agencies to go to organizations outside of the Canadian context. So I think that also is a factor that we need to work on and try to find ways to facilitate the development of data and e-infrastructures internationally beyond those funding boundaries.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Does anyone else want to address that, or you all have? Okay. You're our privacy expert. There was a question, by the way, about the connection, how the importance of the connection between the EuroHPC and the Open Science Cloud for this particular person's community. But I think that Andres addressed that in his comments, so I won't ask that specific question because it's more EuroHPC and European Commission focused. So there was a question there about what is the cost if this doesn't succeed, you know, and who, I mean, it's obvious, we know that it's all for the end user and everything, but, you know, who is this cost really to, and what are the potential other solutions? What do you see if these great ambitious plans don't actually succeed? Jill.
Thanks, Hilary. I think one of the things that keeps me awake at night is thinking about universities and the role of universities and the confidence in our universities to deliver in open science. And it's at the core of really what universities are all about. And in terms of the cost, I worry that we won't remain relevant. If we can't solve some of these challenges across borders and really get the best out of our data sets, then I think our universities are at risk.
Thanks. Not worried. No? Andreas, thank you.
It's I don't really want to speculate too much on what happens if things fail. I think that so far the way in which the implementation of EOSC has been designed, certainly the risk has been fragmentation just by doing it through different projects. However, in diversity and fragmentation, there is also an almost inherently inbuilt mechanism of risk management, which is that all the projects individually do deliver valuable results, which can be used and reused in settings which can be within EOSC, can be outside. So I think that the way in which we've financed this so far has a risk management element built into it. So even if the headline doesn't materialize in a way that we would like, I think the benefits are still there. But the way to significantly reduce the risk of failure, and I come back to the users and the demand side inevitably here, which is that building stuff which no one needs will in the end fail. Building stuff that is directly related to the needs and the requirements of the different user communities and the scientists further decreases that risk. And that, I think, is something that is very important to take on board in EOSC, is to move from a system which is just supply-side driven to one that really embraces the demand side, but also the enabling and the regulatory roles that we have.
So I see a hand in the audience. Is there anybody else who would like to say something to that question? Kostas.
I'll make a point that I made also yesterday at another meeting, that regarding the cost of making data fair and having infrastructures that are working and that you can find the data, access them, use them, and so on. It is not about the cost. I mean, it has a significant cost, and have seen through RDA, for example, many years ago, data done as a blue ribbon report in the US saying that data curation, I mean, the whole cost of data can go up to 6%. I have seen other figures like 1 or 2% of the total cost of research. But what we should more think about is the other 99%. In other words, by producing data that are then lost and that the value that they inherently carry is not extracted, which happens to, I don't know what to believe, but it's more than 50% certainly, and some people say 80 or 90%. This means an enormous value that's been lost, and that is not comparable at all as an order of magnitude with the 1% or the 5% or whatever that dealing with data, making them fair, having the infrastructures to access them and so on, will cost. So I think this is the way that we should be looking at these things. Also, to make another comment, since I got the mic on your previous question, I just remembered that actually on this, and I agree, that the main issue probably with jurisdictional issue with data is personal data protection and privacy. And I remember that RDA had launched a group on this, on legal interoperability, 5 years ago or several years ago. So actually, I would turn the question back to you on what happened with this group, what issues were identified as being inhibiting legal interoperability of data, and then you tell us what we could do about it.
See what happens when somebody has a good memory or was involved at the very beginning? But you make a very good point, Kostas. There's a question there from Sarah Jones while we're going down. I think, Jill, they just touched on the research waste that you brought up just at the beginning, and that, you know, and the reuse of data. So, so Sarah.
Yeah, hi, thanks very much, Hilary. So it's great to hear about all the international like comparators to EOSC, and I wondered if you could reflect, like at a practical level, how do you think we should come together and collaborate? How do we agree standards and align our initiatives?
Is there only one microphone? Oh, there's another microphone there. So how? There's a micro, nobody wants to answer the question. Omo, do you have any?
Well, I'm certainly not going to be leading the conversation, but
no. But you gave some good examples before. You mentioned open air. And other examples
so some of the things we are doing is sort of, you know, keeping all the activity that's going on globally in view, so that when we sort of build our own components, it is in line with what everybody else is doing, at least from a standard point of view. So in terms of the question, I understand that the RDA is supporting a working group, so that's a good start. And I think, you know, the devil will be in the detail, you know, so how do we sort of do that? I suppose that's the question, but it's going to happen when we come together, certainly not on the panel.
Yeah. In fact, Omo is one of the co-chairs of one of the, just let me get this right, Sarah, because Sarah is too, the Globe and Open Science Commons interest group and working group, so two, they're very busy, inside the Research Data Alliance that will, I hope, facilitate that. So that might be a practical answer to that question.
That's what I hope.
I would probably just echo one of the words that was used, and maybe a focus on not lightweight, but accessible standards and best practices at all of the levels. For example, using the six-part EOSC model from governance down to services and infrastructure. So I think if we can define whether it's APIs or something higher up in terms of policy, if we can define an accessible set of lightweight standards and best practices that facilitate interoperability, then I think, and certainly that I think is one of the goals of the GOSC group that Hilary just mentioned. So I think that's a key to achieving that.
Leslie has a question. Leslie McIntosh.
Hello, thank you. So I'm Leslie McIntosh, representing the United States and RDA. But one of the things when I talk to our very diverse country and going down into all of North Americas, including Central America, and I won't speak for South America, we have another representative here, yes. But I want to know how you're bringing in the voices that we're not hearing. We have the indigenous communities, we have communities that are in our country non-white, non-male, that need to be heard. We certainly have the Latin community where open has a different meaning and may have a connotation of abuse rather than being something good. So how are you bringing that into the conversation of what you're working on and the initiative to move science forward?
Maybe just quickly, since I have the mic, in the Canadian context, what we're making a concerted effort to include the Indigenous communities in Canada, of which there are three, the First Nations groups, the Inuit and the Métis. Those, I think, are the approaches and principles defined in each of those three communities in terms of data and research will surface through the new initiative called
Global Indigenous Data
Alliance. Sorry?
Yeah, it's
yes.
the care principle.
So be fair and care.
And care
Is the phrase, the operational phrase. So, and certainly the federal government in Canada puts a lot of emphasis on ensuring the interests of the Indigenous community are considered in the funding and the policy frameworks. So we're certainly making a strong attempt to include the Indigenous communities in our conversations.
Mm-hmm. So I kind of sound like, you know, oh, we do this, but we actually do have an Indigenous data knowledge group. And those care principles that Edith was shouting out about down there were indeed defined during the Botswana plenary meeting. And they are sort of, I would encourage you to have a look at it. It's the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, gida-global.org. And they are really trying to globally look at this Indigenous data and with a view to, I think, also the open science cloud developments across the world. Any other answers for Leslie's question? We're all, not really. No. Okay, oh, Moriyama.
This may not be very much aligned to this discussion, but in my experience in Japan, that when I had some government panel discussion with the legal experts, the scientists discussed about the ownership of data, but the legal experts said the concept of the ownership on the data information are not defined in national legislation. So once it is coming to the industry, the data ownership or data holdings are very much a sensitive issue in the business world. So some of the even science institutions who has a big industrial partnership has a difficulty to how to open the data. Once it is open, that's not subject to the business control. So it is underway.
Yeah. It's a very good point, actually, the industries and enterprises, which we didn't touch on this morning. Christoph has his hand up. I think I'll take that as the last question, and we'll see then. I have one more myself if we have time. Christoph.
Yes. Christoph Bruch from Helmholtz Association. I'm a co-chair of the Legal Interoperability Group, and I'd like to address, Kostas, the question you raised. We produced a paper which actually has two main messages. The first message is be clear about the rights situation of a certain data set. And the second is be as open as possible. Now, the point I would actually like to make is that the second recommendation to be open has not been taken up very broadly because for many institutions, it's important to monetize what they have. It's expected by their funders. And I think especially if you look at the governments, I think they in many cases speak with two tongues. They argue for open science, and at the same time, they ask the universities to present as many patents, for example, as possible. And since we have the Research Directorate and the Single Market here, I think if you look at the way the next framework program is structured, you have this double speak there too.
Okay. No comment?
I think in the current framework program, but the next one, the rules will be very clear. So if the data is open by default, there will be a series of exceptions, including commercial interests, that you will need to state and to specify if you want to keep your data closed. So this will be both, the intention is, because still nothing is decided, but the intention is that this is stated both in the contract that beneficiaries sign with the Commission in this case, as well, and it will be a subject of evaluation as well of the proposal. There will be an obligatory data management plan that comes together at the submission stage with this proposal, in which all the data issues will need to be stated and described, including the closed versus open data. So just in an abstract way saying we might exploit at some time in the future, therefore better keep it closed, I don't think it will be a good justification that will make it through the evaluators that will look at the proposal. On the other hand, having concrete commercial interests that do not allow you to publish, this will be acceptable. Again, it will be a question of how to implement in practice the as open as possible, as closed as necessary, but I'm sure that we'll find a steady state quite soon at the beginning of the program.
Thank you, Kostas. Right, last question. I'm actually going to ask you all to answer it. Bearing in mind that you know, all the open science clouds that you have presented or the initiatives that you have presented are on different levels, are on different, you know, timelines and strategies. But let's talk about success, because we talked about challenges a lot and we know there are many. But you know, what could you consider, or would you consider a success in some years' time with you know, an open science cloud? Its existence, the reuse of the data, or the creation of a value chain, or indeed something else. So what would your measure of success be? And I think I'll go in that order. Is that Kostas? Is it okay if I start with you and move back and leave the last word to the lady?
Okay. What I would consider success is that scientists, I mean, many think so, but I'll just pick one, that scientists that are really sharing their data sets are rewarded. And this is considered a key parameter in their career for their promotion.
Perfect. Thank you. Mariama.
From my perspective, yeah, we are in Japan, we are in Asia, and yeah, interoperability of the internet, interoperability of the software can be achieved through the technology. However, the interoperability of data, interoperability of the data management, or even science culture are really challenging. And that are not separated from the administration too. So government funding has its own restriction, and the institutions the scientists belong to has its own restriction regulations. And sometimes we have a barrier in the kind of their partnership. And so success should be so in my viewpoints, success is so mutual understanding of what's the different culture, what's the different administration, what's the different scientists' everyday lives in the different countries. And I'm not sure this is an appropriate word or not, but in the Eastern world and Western world still has a very big difference in culture and everyday lifestyles. And when you have contact the Japanese government, you may have very unexpected responses. I would beg your pardon that this is our first steps to work together, not only science, but other stakeholders that will make a really global interoperability with the European open science crowd.
Thank you, Mariam. Andreas?
Well, unsurprisingly, I come back to the users and the scientists and the researchers, so I would say that it is the actual tangible benefit and use of EOSC in this case by the community for whom it is designed, i.e. scientists and researchers. That's one pillar, and the second one is the socioeconomic benefit that the outputs of EOSC actually generate to our society as a whole, particularly for public policy making. I mean, that's basically a two-sided approach.
Okay, thank you.
I'm just going to be repeating what Andrea said, because it's particularly important for us in Africa that that there's the capacity of our scientists to sort of appreciate the need for openness. And what Kostas mentioned as well, to be incentivized to be open is going to be very key for us, because the cultural change that's required for open science needs a lot of work.
Okay, thank you. Mark?
I guess for me would be a bit of a stretch target in the that there would be no barriers to true international research collaborations, and that we at least have the real cognitive sense that using these services and infrastructures that we're able to solve or make a significant dent in some of these grand challenges that we talk about, whether it's disaster resilience or the ability to feed people of the world, or all of those things that we typically associate with grand challenges. So that, I'd like to kind of put that there as the stretch target.
Thank you. Jill.
I think for me, I want to take you back to that researcher we were interviewing that I talked about, who said, you know, they couldn't get access to their colleagues' research data sets. And I think success for me is that research not only getting access to his colleagues' data sets, but indeed data sets from all over the world to assist his research. And I think, you know, in one of our oldest cultures, Aboriginal cultures in Western Australia where I'm from, the Wajak Noongar culture, there's a saying which is Danju Kadijin, and it means learning together. And I think success in this context means that we all learn together and we find solutions to these challenges.
Thank you. So I think that's a lovely note to end on. And we have a mantra, I have a mantra in RDA, which I now say it's RDA's, but we say, and it's an African proverb, which is, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. I hope that you have seen the willingness, the openness, and the ideas behind how we can go far together on an international level, and how RDA and the community, and not just RDA, but all the players across the world and in Europe can support the implementation of not just the European Open Science Cloud, but open science clouds and initiatives across the world. So thank you so much for your attention, and apologies for the slight delay. Thank you very much to my panelists. I really appreciate your comments and time.
And thank you very much, Hilary, for this panel. Okay, we reconvene here in half an hour, so 20 past 11, okay? Sharp. Okay, so we are ready to start again. Please take your seat. And we start again with the second plenary session, which is really focused on the EOSC working groups, the early achievements and the plans. And the first speaker of the session is Sarah Jones from the Digital Curation Center, and Sarah is the chair of the FAIR working group.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sarah. So I think we had a really interesting session this morning, and what I'm going to do is just give you a quick overview to the working groups, and then we're going to focus the main part of the session on the panel discussion, because I know there's a lot of interest in the audience, and I want to give you time to ask questions and to suggest solutions for us. So first off, I'm going to give an introduction to the working groups and what we've been doing, and then the progress to date. So Hans-Josef gave an overview to the governance structure, and I wanted to flag where the working groups sit into this. So there are three main areas. We have all of the kind of funded projects, coalition of the doers, big data initiatives happening in different member states, and those constituents, which I think many of you are part of, are really building the EOSC. And the governance structure, the two boards, the governance board and the executive board, are there to try and coordinate and steer that implementation. And we have a broader community which acts as a stakeholder forum to feed in on that, and specifically the working groups. So there are 5 working groups so far, and they're part of the executive board. So members of the executive board chair each of the working groups. So the 5 that we have a landscape working group, which, as it says on the tin, is looking at that broader landscape, what's in place in every member state, and how prepared are they to feed into EOSC. The rules of participation is defining the rules for different service providers and users of EOSC, what's expected, what kind of set of rules do they have to play by to participate. Architecture and FAIR I see as the key building blocks of EOSC, so it's looking at the technical architecture, but also looking at the FAIR data aspects and the way we need to ensure data is structured so it can be understood and reused. And then underpinning everything is sustainability, because we need to make sure that these services are viable long-term, and it's not something that's just on a project basis. So we do actually have some other groups that are either they've been set up or they're proposed, and we're going to be discussing them on Friday. We have a communications task force. Now, this task force is a little bit different to the working groups. It's not something that we have externals on. It just has members of the exec board, the EC, and the EOS Secretariat project. And that task force is looking at the branding for EOSC, registering the trademark, and looking at the communications. And the EOS Secretariat project has specific work packages about the communications as well. And then the two groups which we expect to set up are around skills and the international perspective, as Carol flagged this morning. I think the way we set up those groups might be slightly different. Obviously, with the international group, we need to get international participation. And potentially, I don't know whether, because it's such a cross-cutting theme, it might be something that we have to try and feed into every working group rather than having just a separate activity. The initial 5 working groups were largely constituted of members that were nominated by the governance board. So every member state was allowed to nominate people into the groups, and we accepted all the governance board nominations that came in. We made some nominations for the FAIR group. I was concerned about balance. I had a very male-heavy and Western European-heavy group, and also very service-heavy. I wanted to ensure we had more researchers involved, more females, more Eastern European and early career researcher engagement. So I nominated some other people to the group to bring balance as well. And within the architecture group, because this is about the technical service delivery, there are a lot of representatives from Horizon 2020 projects, because they are the key building blocks of EOSC. We also have contributions in a number of forms to the working groups. So all of the working groups are reaching out to existing projects and initiatives, because that's really our core constituency. We need to work with what you've been providing. We're not trying to build something new. The architecture working group members have also nominated experts in certain areas like PIDs and AAI to different task forces. And various working groups are either inviting projects onto telcons or commissioning consultancy reports. There's a co-creation fund which we're commissioning a few reports on, things like legal interoperability and the legal entity. So this is the working groups by numbers. Most of the working groups have somewhere between 20 to 40 members, so some of them are actually really quite large, and this is part of the rationale about why we've divided up the remits and established a number of task forces. And we have a really good representation from the different countries in Europe. Obviously, some of the countries that are more advanced, like the UK and the Netherlands and France and Germany, have more representation than others. So I think we do need to try and engage more Eastern European countries too. One of the key deliverables that's come out recently is the work plan. And this tells you, what are essentially our timeline and agenda is up until the end of 2020. So Carol touched on this earlier on. You can get this on the EC's website under this DOI. And you'll have seen this slide. This is essentially the first iteration of EOSC by the end of 2020. This is what we've committed to deliver that came out of the staff working document that the Commission put forward. And this is how it breaks down across those different working groups. So obviously the rules of participation, there's a group around that, and the landscape are looking at what's going on in the member states. There are some aspects which cross the working groups, so specifically the interoperability framework and the persistent identifier policy. The FAIR group's leading on these, but we're engaging the architecture and rules of participation, because it's not something that's just about FAIR data. And this is how that set of activities maps out onto a timeline. And I think the key thing to emphasize here is that within this first year, so up until the end of 2019, we're trying to release outline versions of various things. So an outline PID policy, the initial mapping of what's going on in the different member states, the initial rules of participation. And for me, the most critical thing is that we have lots of iteration and testing. because it's no good that we just release EOSC or a minimum version of EOSC at the end of 2020 and just hope it flies. We have to really engage continually with users and check that we're on the right track. So I think throughout 2020 there'll be lots of iteration to then release the final version. And what I would stress about the working groups is that we're not reinventing wheels. So if we go back to the kind of governance structure diagram, this arrow here is way too small in that diagram for my liking, because the interaction is the really critical component. The working groups and the executive board need to interact with all of the projects and all of those different stakeholders, because that's where the different services and the approaches are being developed, and we need to kind of coordinate those, to endorse the different approaches, to help with the consultation. So taking what we say in the work plan, I've tried to map this out. Essentially, there are various groups that will be defining and building EOSC, so specifically the projects and the inputs from the governance board. And these will feed into the work that we do on the exec board. So the landscape and the sustainability working groups have a very close alignment with the governance board because they're a lot more strategic and political, whereas the architecture fair and rules of participation are really about the infrastructure and the services. So they're a lot more focused on what's coming out of the different projects. And as I said, the iteration and the testing is really critical. And within the work plan, we flagged 2 key vehicles for undertaking this. The EOSC Secretariat project has set up a liaison platform to do consultations, and there are various events like the EOSC Symposium. And we also talk about the importance of the Research Data Alliance as a way to engage not just the European community, but the global research community. Because what we do in Europe, it can't be a silo. We have to ensure that our approaches can align with and work with others internationally. So, what have we achieved so far? Within the Landscape Working Group, which is chaired by Jan Krusak, who's the ESFRI chair, they've done an initial kind of stock taking of what's going on in all of the different member states and delivered a draft document which is going to be discussed at our exec board meeting this Friday, and will go to the governance board thereafter. So this gives us a first kind of status of what's happening across all of the different member states in Europe. There are a number of projects that the European Commission's funded, the national initiatives, the Infra EOSC 5B projects, if you like all the local jargon. And they're starting now, so they will feed into a second iteration of that report, which will be completed by the end of this year. And the Landscape Group is planning to subcontract some work to do a lot of the analysis of that, and then to run a validation workshop in January. So they've already done a lot of activity in this first period. If you're interested in hearing more about the Landscape Group and also consulting on that, John is going to be chairing the breakout session this afternoon on Landscape, which is going to give you a review of the information gathering and the next steps and what the intended outcome is, that we ensure the EOSC and the national plans for investment and policy understand how to contribute to this single European open science landscape. They do want a lot of consultation and comments on that report, so if you want to go to that breakout, it's in U9, and Sara Garavelli will direct us all to the right place after lunch. Within the sustainability group, they've also been incredibly busy over the summer period, not enough holidays for this group. Their first step was to develop a straw man document, and within this document, they've kind of proposed an iterative approach, a gradual growth of EOSC. So starting with an MVP for publicly funded researchers, and then iterating to establish the kind of digital marketplaces. So we're then reaching out to the public sector and industry. And I mentioned about the co-creation fund that the EOSC Secretariat has. This is a way that we're able to commission some studies, and there are 2 studies planned on legal entity and business models. Those should be commissioned around the end of this year or early next year, and the group as a whole will present its results in Q3 of 2020. So they've made a really good inroad to get started on that. You can engage with the sustainability group, which is chaired by Rupert and Lydia this afternoon. There are a few questions which they've put forward for discussion, and I really like the fact that many of these are looking at the international angle as well. So what do users perceive as the MVP, the minimum set of services that we need? How do we think international research infrastructures can best engage or interoperate? And I think that's really critical. We need to be thinking globally, not just about the European aspect. And this question came up on the panel, and actually I really liked the responses earlier, but what constitutes success for EOSC? What is it that we're actually trying to achieve through this? The Rules of Participation group have had a very strong input from the EOSC pilot project. There was already a lot of work done on the Rules of Participation, and what they've been doing is working on scoping and partitioning the scope of their remit, because you're going to need different Rules of Participation for different roles for users and service providers. And again, they have a number of questions for the breakout. They want to understand how the Rules of Participation should constrain what service providers require of users, how users should discover and access EOSC services, thinking about minimizing the barriers to taking part. I think it's really important that we make it feasible for people to engage, and also thinking about how these rules apply to non-European users. And that idea of reciprocity came up earlier in the panel too. Within the FAIR group, which I chair, we've divided our remit into 4 task forces. And again, as I mentioned before, this was really for practical purposes. We have quite large groups, and we want people to be able to do concerted work. So we have a group looking at fair practice, which is feeding into the interoperability group, so we know what practice is happening in each discipline. There's a group looking at the PID policy for EOSC, and they will be joined by some members from architecture. And we also have a group looking at metrics and certification, and that's addressing both the data metrics and then also different schema for certifying services. All 4 of those task forces, again, have been very busy over summer. They've all been defining their scope and reviewing existing work that's come out of various projects or RDA or other global initiatives. And within the different groups, they've made progress. So the Fair Practice group have been defining a matrix, so we can actually see, the different practices, the different standards, repositories, data types and formats that are in place, and the relative maturity in different communities. We've been working on an initial PID policy, and that's been taking strong inputs from the Freya project. That's something that we'd like to consult on at coming events. Within the metrics and certification, we've been liaising closely both with FAIR's FAIR, one of the projects in the EC, and the Research Data Alliance. There's a group on FAIR data maturity, which is a global collaboration to try and define the metrics, and that's something that we're really taking as an input for that work. And within the interoperability group, we've been trying to think about what that interoperability framework should cover, what it should look like, whether it should have different levels that we face. So we've been looking at parallel initiatives like accessibility standards and the European interoperability framework. Within the FAIR breakout, which will take place in this room today, they're going to focus on 2 of those task forces. They'll look at fair practice, and they're also going to look at certification. And one of the open questions we have about certification is we have very strong standards for repository certification, and I'm pleased that the recommendation that was made in the Turning FAIR into Reality report has been adopted by FAIR's FAIR and others, and we're picking up on the Quartra seal. But there are lots of services, and we wonder if there are other certification schema needed for other services, or is it good enough that we just certify the repositories and the rules of participation are a strong enough mark for the other services? So they'd like your inputs on these thoughts, and there's a group from the different task forces that will lead that session. And then the final area is architecture. and Jean-François has been working with his group to identify different task forces. There are 5 key areas of work that they've defined, and 2 of those task forces have been established. So the AAI and the Persistent Identifier Policy. And as I mentioned, that PID work will be done in collaboration with the FAIR working group. And within the architecture breakout today, we'll be discussing 2 aspects of that remit. So the PID policy, we have some questions around that, about the scope, who are the stakeholders, what do we need to include, and when does this need to be provided? And within the interoperability framework, we want to think again about, the audience for this, what kind of coverage is needed, and also whether it's something that's normative or descriptive. So we have members from each of these task forces that will present some ideas, and we'd really welcome your feedback and lessons from other international contexts. So that's a quick update of what the working groups are doing. You're very welcome to ask questions now for clarification, but what I propose is that we actually start the panel, and then you can hear from all the working groups, not just from myself. And just a reminder that there is a Slido, so follow this link if you want to type questions in rather than speaking out in person. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So as you suggested, we are going to start the panel, and I would like to introduce the moderator for this second panel, which is Anu Nuutinen. She's working in the development program for data management and scientific computing at the Finnish Ministry, and she's also the Finnish representative in the EOSC Governing Board.
Thank you very much, and let me actually first invite our panel members, and then I introduce the theme of the panel and introduce our speakers. You can just fill in. Perfect. So this session is a lead up to the following breakout sessions, which Sarah presented briefly. And in those breakout sessions, the working group coordinators will discuss with the participants the strategic priorities of the working groups and identify any gaps. It has been mentioned that we have the Slido, and we have already collected some of your questions from that interface. So this is definitely an interactive session. So please comment, and even you can raise hands. We can then probably circulate the mic if needed. In the discussion, we will be focusing as much as possible on the concrete steps towards EOSC during the autumn 19 and next year. But of course, also taking a look beyond 2020. And I think this session also provides an opportunity for the working group chairs to elaborate a bit further some of the points and some of the early results which were presented in the overview. So then, introductions. Let me start to my left, researcher Jean-François Abramatique. He comes from INRIA, which is the French Research Institute in Computer Science and Applied Mathematics, and he's chairing the Architecture Working Group. Then next, Head of IT, Rupert Luck, from EMBL, Heidelberg, and he's chairing the Sustainability Working Group. Next to him, we have Juan Bigarregui. He represents Research Data Alliance and is head of data division at Science and Technology Facilities Council in the UK. And he is chairing the Rules of Participation Working Group. Then next, I'm happy to introduce John Womersley. He is the Director General of the European Spallation Source. Eric comes from Sweden, or Eric is the ESSS is placed in Sweden. And he's also a member of the, as all of them, EOSC Executive Board, and we have agreed that we will direct some landscape questions to him. Last but not least, I will reintroduce Sarah Jones. She's Associate Director for the Digital Curation Center, comes from Glasgow, and is chairing the FAIR working group. So first, I have a joint question for all of you. We can start here. And this is in Finnish, we call let's put the cat on the table to start with the difficult questions. So the first question is, could you briefly highlight one challenge in building EOSC which needs to be addressed before 2020 in the area of your working group, and also kind of a realistic or some kind of solution to it, a realistic way to solve it? Please.
I assume you're saying the end of 2020, right? Because if it's the beginning. Okay, so we have multiple challenges in architecture, but being asked to single one, it will be directed to users, right? So the first target for us is to recognize that users are the first-class citizen of EOSC, and that's why the first task force that we've launched is about authentication, authorization, infrastructure, AI, so that each individual, each of the 1.7 million researchers in Europe are recognized as first-class citizens. So that's our challenge.
Then we move the mic to Rupert, please.
So I should point out I'm co-chairing the Sustainability Working Group with Lydia Borrell. But in terms of the challenges, I think we understand there's a very strong desire to provide more and more access to open data, and so also to put together the associated services that should be fed and coupled with funding models to ensure that publicly funded commercial and data service providers can support this foreseeing greatly and very ambitious expanded usage of the 1.7 million researchers across Europe to that resource. We understand there's a political will to support open science, and also to see EOSC as a core resource to achieve that and to contribute. So I think that the dialogue between the member states and the European Commission that is taking place will help us to build and to form and find the feasible funding models across the next couple of months.
Then next, please.
So thinking about this from the point of view of rules of participation, you come to the fact that rules of participation are kind of setting the quality standards and the standards that will enable trust in the services of the EOSC. So for rules of participation, the question is, how high should we set the bar? If we set the bar too low, then the added value of EOSC is low. If we set the bar too high, then there's going to be low participation. So there are many, many balances we have to find in where to set the bar. For example, do we want the services to be of maximum value to the communities they're already serving and increase the value to their current communities? Or do we want things to broaden out and to be accessed across different communities? I was reminded earlier by Hilary of that saying about walking together or working alone. I think that is one of the key things we have to think about when we set rules of participation. Do we try and enable small communities to move quickly, or do we try and work across communities more? So setting those balances in terms of how high the barrier should be, how much do we want to enforce quality to enable trust, or how loosely do we want to set things so that we can maximize participation? That's the key challenge for me.
Thank you.
Okay, so on the landscape front, we have a 186-page draft document, so a lot of information has already been gathered. But one of the things you learn when you gather information is what is missing, as well as what is there. So we've been trying to survey the policy landscape and the infrastructure landscape. The policies across Europe are strongly mandating open access to publications, and that's clearly now in place almost everywhere. What is not yet in place is that same level of mandate towards openness of data. And I think that's something we need to work on, because that's what I would expect funders to require from the research projects that they support in the coming few years. As far as the infrastructure investments are concerned, it's, again, straightforward to get a mapping of what exists, what facilities are there, and what is supported. It's much harder to get a mapping of what is planned, and part of that is understandable, of course, and in some cases those plans may not fully exist. But what I would like to see is some sort of political commitment that future investments will, if technically possible, align with the European cloud ecosystem, as Carol explained. What we need to do then is use this landscape or the survey of what currently exists, synthesize the missing bits, and they may require political commitments that are above our level, but to use the governing board then to try and stimulate that within this timescale of 2020.
Thank you.
Okay, so for me, the thing that's most challenging that's within the remit of our group is the interoperability framework, because it's so all-encompassing, and I think it's going to be very difficult to get something that's at the right level, that's high enough level, you know, that it's practical and it's not too specific, but it actually needs to be meaningful for implementation as well. And part of the reason why this scares me is because there isn't a direct project input. This isn't the sole concern of any of the existing projects. So it's something that we're going to have to invest a lot more time as a working group into actually creating and steering. What we've been doing to try and overcome that challenge so far is looking at other initiatives. So looking at the European interoperability framework, looking at the e-health interoperability levels. And what I would be particularly keen to get from the discussion today is any insights on what's happening internationally. How is the ARDC or initiatives in Canada and Africa, how are you addressing interoperability? How are you specifying that? So hopefully we can reach a global consensus.
Okay, thank you. Next, we will be building a little bit on the overview of the work plans, and I have chosen a couple of themes to elaborate a little bit, and I think we could start with rules of participation, and I'm addressing this question to Juan. So from a rules of participation point of view, this is a very basic question. So that's why I wanted to start with this. So how should users discover and access EOSC services?
Yeah, thank you. As I already said, a lot of this is about getting the right balance. Let's talk about discovery first. The more you centralize the facilities, the more you centralize the catalogs, the easier it is to discover things. But on the other hand, the harder it is to get information into the catalogs. So we have to balance the centralization versus the distribution. Take PIDs, for example, and I know Sarah was already talking about two different task forces or working together on the idea of PID policy. We take PIDs, it's very difficult or if not impossible to imagine a single PID authority that was issuing all the PIDs for all the systems. Well, that's just not going to happen in the foreseeable future. So we're going to have a lot of different PID providers, and this is good. This gives us resilience, as was also said earlier this morning, that diversity gives you resilience. But you need to somehow enable cross-searching, cross-cataloging across those, so you need a registry of PID providers or something like that. And I think that approach of diversity and multiplicity with some centralizing registry over it is an approach that might work for a lot of the different kinds of services that we're talking about. For metadata standards, again, we're going to have lots and lots of metadata standards. How do we register them all so that you can find the right one that applies to the data that you're looking at? For a lot of this work, we're going to need intermediaries, I believe, so that you can present this multiplicity of different things in a way that field-specific researchers can understand. So we'll need field-specific or domain-specific intermediaries presenting information that is across the whole of EOSC to a particular field in the way that they like. And above all that, I think most importantly, perhaps, we have to do all this without breaking the current infrastructures, because we have researchers working in environments that actually work for them today, and we're trying to add value to that. So whatever we do, we have to build on the existing work without breaking it. For access, for example, many different access mechanisms working across all these different infrastructures. We're going to have to try and find a way to enable all of those whilst at the same time unifying across them. So that's my view.
Thank you. I will still pick up on the persistent identifier policy, the PIDs, which have been mentioned several times already. The PID policy issues are also at the heart of EOSC architecture. So how would you like to, or what would you like to add? How do you see that kind of element?
Okay, in my first answer, I mentioned the users. In my second, I mentioned the data, right? So Juan talked about services and alluded to data. I will focus on the data. So the ultimate goal is for the scientist to be able to access the data that he or she needs to do his research, right? So in a distributed world that we have learned to work with since the web has been available, you have two ways to, there are many ways, but two of them are standout. One is cataloging, so that you go to the catalog. The other, more popular, at least on the web now, is search, right? So we all know what happened to Yahoo, and we all know what happened to Google after the web deployed. I believe that ultimately we need to facilitate, in the whole variety that has been described by Juan, we need to provide search. And being from the computer science environment, we know it's hard, right? In other words, yes, Google is very powerful, but the people that created Google were very skilled, very expert people, right? And the algorithm that they developed and the deployment that they put together was able to face the challenge of searching on the web. Similarly, we will have EOSC, in order to deliver, will be, in order to deliver the real value to the scientist, will have someday to have search. And if you want to have search, then you need PID, right? You need first, the first layer, you need to start with being able to identify the data. It's not sufficient by a huge margin, right? Of course, you will need then, and Juan also alluded to it, you will then metadata ontologies that will allow for the search to operate. But I think that's in this road, in this avenue that we're engaging now, and that's the midterm challenge. I mentioned the short-term challenge was the AI. The midterm challenge is to deploy a PID environment and a metadata environment that will allow scientists to search for the data they need.
Excellent. Then we move to FAIR issues. So the FAIR working group is, among other things, investigating metrics and certification. And this is a collaboration with FAIRsphere and RDA, and because we are here at the RDA Plenary, or RDA associated event, I want to ask that what are the, some of the key issues in terms of metrics and certification which need to be addressed?
So I think one of the main challenges with metrics is that they can be very divisive. People want to control the metrics, and then also people want to game the system so that they are seen, perceived in a good light. I think for that reason, it's really important that we do things collaboratively, and this is why we're looking to that FAIR maturity group to take their recommendations on metrics as the input of what we do within EOSC. Within certification, we're also well placed because we've got things like Quartra Seal to build on. So I think for us, that's one of the areas where I think we've got a lot more strong input. So I'm less concerned about those issues, but we do need to be mindful of, you know, the research culture and the way things can be. It can generate different behaviors to what our intention is. So we do need to monitor and track the metrics and potentially change them over time.
Thank you. Next, I would like to ask you a couple of questions about user engagement and how do we really take various stakeholders into account. For example, here today we have representatives of various H 2020 projects and also disciplinary services contributing to EOSC. And if you think, could you give some examples of the liaison activities which are already taking place or which are kind of in the pipeline when you think about from the point of view of your group? Some success stories or challenge stories, whomever wants to start, please.
So the Sorman document has been mentioned already. Maybe I give a little bit of a very brief overview again. So this has been a work that has been contributed during the summer period by the group to see what could be actually the roads of assembling EOSC, what could be the potential building blocks, and then also to drive, to use this to drive the studies that will be carried on in terms of analyzing business models, legal entities and other areas, do risk analysis and things like that. So we had foreseen this originally as a way to inform and to align our views together with the governance board. So there it was presented. It was also presented, and that will go along your question, to the consultation of the EOSC Horizon 2020 projects on the 9th and 10th of September to see what is their feedback. And also we have provided this to of course, to the colleagues of the executive board. So now we are collecting the feedback from the various audiences and communities. Of course, I mean, this is not shared to the wider public, but a very careful approach to see what could be initial feedback so that we have a way to understand, are we on the right track with this approach, and to use this document actually as we foresaw it to lead the discussion and to come to a conclusion on how do we put these things together.
I saw some other hands also, so maybe there.
Yeah, so we have included in the landscape survey input from all of the relevant Horizon 2020 funded projects that we're aware of. Those includes e-infrastructures as well as the infra-EOSC calls that are specifically targeted to developing policy or implementation prototypes for EOSC itself. And we'll be using inputs from two of the projects which are currently underway now, doing survey type activities this autumn. But I wanted to emphasize one point, which I think, having been on a review panel for a couple of these projects last week, we in the EB and governing board for EOSC should give them feedback too, because they are working hard, in some cases developing prototype software implementations, in some cases developing policy recommendations, and we need to make sure that that work is useful and answering the kind of questions that we need to be answered, because it would be a shame if their strong efforts do not feed into questions that we need answers to on the timescales when we need answers to them.
Yeah, I was going to pick up on the user angle, actually. So I was really pleased to hear Andreas's comments this morning in the panel about the central role of research communities, because for me, that's something that we really need to drive more within EOSC, both in terms of the governance structure and also with the Stakeholder Forum. I think we need to engage researchers more and also potentially working through different mediators, so the research infrastructures or through the research institutions. Because ultimately, if we aren't driving the building of EOSC from the user requirements, from that scientific need, there's a really strong chance that we might build something and they won't come. So we have to really be focused on the user needs. And one of the things, we often, we lament the fact that, researchers just go and use Dropbox, but they use that because it works well, it functions well, the interface is really intuitive. So I think we probably need to shift our mentality a little bit away from research projects to something that's more of a service delivery focus. Because the reason commercial providers are so successful is because they do put the user at the center. They look at what the user needs, they build systems around that, they spend a lot of money on, you know, the usability, the interface, that consultation. And I think if we really want EOSC to be a success and, you know, to be as good as the competitors or even better, which is what we should be striving for, then we have to really increase that focus in the work that we do.
As a last question in the theme about user engagement, how do you see the role of national research organizations in building EOSC? Like, do you have some messages or encouraging words, or what should they take into account to kind of enable or support the success of EOSC? Was this anybody?
I think I answered this already in my opening remarks. I would like them to make a commitment to open data, as in the same way that we've seen a commitment towards open access to publishing. And I would like to see an in-principle commitment that future national investments in e-infrastructure, and I guess this goes for repositories as well, should be connected, if possible, to the EOSC. And not attempting to build some national science cloud which is separate. That would be a waste of effort, and it would reduce the productivity of the whole system.
I think going along the lines what Andreas mentioned previously, and if we are looking more towards addressing societal challenges and missions, and I think it will be useful if we make happen that the research infrastructures are encouraged to look at this angle and to see what is possible with EOSC in order to support their work along these lines and to develop in that area.
Okay, then we move on to some of the questions which we have actually received from the audience. And let's start, this is related to FAIR. How can we encourage non-publicly funded organizations to make their data fair?
So one of the key things I'd flag about FAIR is that it's not the same as open. People often conflate the two, and I think there's no reason for anyone not to want to make their data fair, because it's making it useful to you yourself, that you can find it, you can understand it, you can reuse it. So I think it's in any, you know, non-publicly research-funded organization's interest to do that, because they want to be able to use their own data and get that intelligence and drive whatever activity they're engaged in. I think where they would find more of a challenge is around being open, because there's, you know, a commercial value to those insights. But there's no reason for anyone not to be fair.
Okay, another question from the audience says that we are hearing much about helping researchers find and reuse data, but evidence shows that biggest barrier to open research or open data is actually researchers' fear of misuse of their work. And this is suggesting a lot of data is simply not being shared. How will EOSC address this bigger cultural/trust problem? We have kind of touched upon this issue a little bit already earlier, but please feel free to add something.
Okay, so the first remark is you should not expect EOSC to solve all problems for all users, right? So in my own facility, we face this problem. Because when ESS is operational, scientists will come and do experiments, several thousand experiments per year, so several thousands of users. They will bring samples with them and then study the composition of those samples, the material structure, the molecular structure, whatever. Therefore, when they make that data open and available, which we will require, they're also sharing details of the sample that they brought. And that contains their own intellectual property to some extent. So the open access policy that we have adopted means that the original author of the data will be notified and will have some rights over the reusability of that data. It will not simply be available for anonymous download by FTP to be reinterpreted as you wish, because they are not just reinterpreting the data, they're reinterpreting the original sample that was part of it. So I think we need to have mechanisms like that respect the rights of the original author, the original creator of the data, in domain-appropriate ways.
Would you like to add?
I just support the same sort of view and say that, in fact, transparency or openness can help us here rather than hinder. Currently, if I've got some data that I'm keeping quiet until I publish it and somebody gets hold of it and publishes it instead of me and doesn't acknowledge, there's perhaps very little I can do. If my data is out there in the open and we have a provenance framework that can trace the use of data and somebody takes my data and publishes it and pretends it wasn't mine, it's much easier to find out that they've done that. So I think that openness actually helps avoid this kind of thing rather than be a barrier.
Okay, then the next question from the audience. How will EOSC balance or bridge easy use of commercial cloud and big data services by researchers for majority of research tasks and services offered by EOSC infrastructure, though? So this competition, what kind of comments do you have on that?
I'm not quite sure. So I'm not quite sure I correctly understand the question, but I think it goes along the lines: how do we make comparable the different angles? That will be, of course, a challenge, and at the same time also an opportunity. There will be, so we propose this model of marketplaces to where we have some rival competition going on, and introduce the ability for the commercial sector to participate. At the same time, we appreciate there is a number of very well-established e-infrastructures across Europe that do that provide useful services, that provide very, very attractive services to the researchers, and we need to find a model that funds both and that makes happen both of these areas, so that they can coexist in one form or the other. I'm not claiming that we have found within the report all the necessary elements. We have seen various replies and feedback, very interesting and very useful feedback. I think what is important, what Hans-Josef Linkens mentioned this morning, is by the introduction of the marketplaces, we want to make sure that we don't introduce barriers to existing frameworks that are established. But at the same time also use this opportunity to bring in other and wider scope in this area, so that the researcher, which is at the center of this, has the choice of what they want to use in order to support their research.
Thank you. Then at this point, last question from the audience. How will EOSC handle very confidential research data, so personal data? Or maybe reformulate a little bit, what is the EOSC angle to the confidential data issue? You don't have to give an all-encompassing answer, you can just highlight maybe some ideas.
I'll pass really, but I will say, I'll echo the words we heard earlier this morning: as open as possible, as closed as necessary. And we have lots of regulatory frameworks and the like around personal data, which obviously have to be part of the rules of participation. Even if they're not sort of reiterated in the rules of participation, we'll probably have some catch-all that says, of course, everything compliant with legislative and regulatory requirements.
Yeah, and I think research communities like medical, research in social sciences, in criminal justice, things like that, have well-established frameworks. And we need to make sure that our metadata and our rules of participation respect those discipline-specific ways of working that are trusted. Otherwise, we'll be shutting certain communities out of effectively using EOSC.
Yeah, maybe just in addition to that, I think, again, we might be hampered by a misnomer in the name, because EOSC, even though it says open in it, it's not only about open data. So we should be open wherever possible, but we have to have secure data services. And I think what's actually really critical as well is that we're not doing something new in EOSC. We're not building an entirely new platform. We're federating existing trusted services. So there are secure services in certain research communities where things need to be closed and controlled access. And what we're doing is adding value to those through that integration. we're not having a new platform where it's all open and, essentially no controls at all. So I think it's really just about the messaging often that people might get confused about, the remit, but we have to have services that are appropriate for all science.
Rupert? Maybe I can quickly add to this. There is, as an example, as a use case, of course, the medical field was mentioned. Sharing genomics data, health data from human individuals is, of course, a very delicate area, and of course, hospitals are very often not allowed to share this data and leave this data out of the house. In initiatives such as the European Genotype Archive, for instance, they follow a model where they try to bring together these different resources. So where in some sort of a fair approach, this data can be found, and then there can be, on a contractual basis, access to this data can be asked by the researchers, but in the end, the data stays with the organization and complies with all the matters in terms of consent and legal issues.
Thank you. So we have been talking here a little bit about what EOSC can and what it should be solving and what it can or what should be solved somewhere else. And building on that, I would like to ask your opinions about, or how do you see the member state or the European preparedness for EOSC? Where are we at the moment? And do you have some messages for countries? If we are not yet where we need to be in a year or year and a half.
How brutal should we be? I think there is a wait and see attitude, which at some level is justified. But if one waits too long, the project will be disappointing. So I think open science is coming. It cannot be stopped. There is a global tide towards greater sharing of data, towards things like FAIR. What EOSC tries to do is provide a framework, a governance framework, a policy framework, a set of standards that will facilitate that transition. The transition is being driven by the science community. And most of the funding will also come from outside this what Carol described as the EOSC legal entity, or the central coordinating entity. It will come through individual science communities, it will come through research grants that are going to happen anyway, it will come through national investments. It will be much more productive if all of those things are working within a common set of standards and a common vision, and if they physically connect their networks. But it'll come anyway. So the question is, does it come coherently? In the scientific jargon, do we get n times the contributions, or do we get some random walk where we get square root of n out of all of this? Do we get a cloud which is actually delivering, or do we get lots of mini clouds that sometimes talk to each other? Do we get domain-specific clouds? Do we get domain-specific FAIR, stuff that's only findable to people who are already working in those areas? Do we get large investments in member states that are not fully open because they are targeted towards particular institutions or domains that they wish to promote? So I don't think the question is, will open science be here? The question is, will people see EOSC as a useful catalytic investment that gets a more productive, faster, more coherent European implementation of this? And of course, the same question goes globally too. So I hope that EOSC catalyzes a globally applicable set of standards, and to do that, we have to listen to the rest of the world as well. So quite a long answer, but I wanted to say something about what I think could happen in a good scenario and a less good scenario.
Thank you. Does anybody want to add? Please.
I think what is very important is, of course, this is all about data, and so it will be very important that we have a couple of countries that take the lead and hopefully have the most attractive data sets that we can get into EOSC, and that we have an early commitment so that we build momentum that we steer a process of addition of further resources. So there will be a need for some to take lead in this, and that will be very important.
Yes.
So I think that some of the most interesting data sets are European in scale, not national in scale. So it might be European research infrastructures, some of the ESFRI infrastructures, like yours, for example, that could take that lead.
And still, we have been talking also, or mentioning the timeline and the tightness of it. And I still want to ask you, what do you see, what are the really key elements when we look at the next year and a half, which need to be addressed, or what we need to focus on in order to keep the schedule? Sarah is volunteering to start. Thank you.
So I think there are a couple of things that are important there. I think as a group, as an exec board, we have to be quite agile. We have to make decisions quickly because there isn't long left. So when we were writing the work plan, it is a concern how much there is to do in that time frame. It's very ambitious. But I think one of the key things I'd stress, we're not doing the building. You know, like all of these projects that have been funded by the European Commission and elsewhere are doing the activities, and I fear that in some cases there might be a mismatch between their work plans and expected due dates and what the essential timeline we got from the staff working document. So I think one thing we need to do is really work together and try and have a bit of give and take where there is like a mismatch, because ultimately we're all striving for the same goal. And I think we just need to try and work together to achieve as much as we can by the end of 2020. But EOSC will go on way beyond that. It's a much bigger vision. It's just that our remit is just for this first period.
Or one? Oh.
So,
please.
I'm coming back on the MVP, or whatever we call it. I think for us as a group to move on and to find a way to the studies and stuff, it will be very important to analyze what actually is consensus regarding the MVP. What are the services? What are the bare minimum services that we put on a horizontal level, and what could be the data infrastructures that are aligned to this? That is one of the critical things that we definitely need to solve very soon. I think the other important element, which I will not comment further on, I think Carl mentioned strategic partnerships as a way to see a long-term kind of funding stream and model, that these discussions are also ongoing discussions that have a timing constraint, as has been also outlined by Andreas and Kostas.
So we've heard several times today that EOSC is not a top-down initiative, and obviously this question is a kind of top-down question, and there naturally has to be some top-down elements in EOSC. But if we look at it, the same question from a bottom-up perspective, I think the kind of vision and the aim is clear. It's not so removed from the RDA mission and aim that you can see on the poster behind there. And so it's quite easy to know when you're taking a step forward. If you see something become more fair, become more open, you know it's a step forward. Not necessarily easy to know what the right first step is, but it's easy to recognize when something's forward. So my approach to this is, well, let's start now, let's move forward, and let's keep going. Let's not worry too much, if I'm not putting my foot in it here, about what we can achieve by the end of 2020. As long as we keep going in the right direction, and we're going to have to keep going for a long time.
I think I've repeatedly said it, well, no, a few times mentioned it during the executive board meetings. We all share the ultimate goal, right? I mean, we're all doing that to improve society. We're all doing that for, develop market and develop services that will allow people to do their activity, whatever they are, much better. We still in order to get to that point, we need to decide what are the initial steps that we're doing, for example, in 2020. And we've discussed about, can we do things, there were questions about can we do things on not public funded data? Well, probably, but frankly, later, right? We first need to be able to address the problem of the scientists who are ready to open their data. First, it's already that hard enough that we need to dedicate energy in order to be able to, for people who are willing to open their data, to do it in a fair way so that other scientists will be able to access it, right? And that's one. Two, in order to convince the ones that are a little bit reluctant, we need to have success stories. Right? If we have cross-disciplinary research success stories that have been deployed based upon open data, the people who are reluctant to show their data may think twice, right? So my point is, for 2020, I urge that we focus on open data and environment in order to be able to do cross-disciplinary activity and be able to, another example of success story would be reproducibility, right? So if we were able to assemble publication, data, and software, we didn't use the word software enough in this conversation, right? Because the three are essential if you want to do reproducibility. If we have reproducibility success story and cross-disciplinary success stories, I'm sure there are lots of people who are reluctant to get into the bandwagon who will jump into the bandwagon.
Thank you. That was a powerful statement. John wants to add something before we are approaching the final round.
Yeah, so I think we're on a journey here, and there are a number of steps in this journey. EOSC started out as a concept. It's led to some funded projects which have prototyped aspects of it. Nobody yet mentioned the EOSC portal, which does exist and is in some sense what did you say? You said a less than fully viable product. It's a prototype, somewhere between an alpha and a beta test of these concepts. So we know that in principle this is a solvable problem. But during the same time, the governance of EOSC has become step by step clearer as well. And I think in these kind of meetings, which I've been attending for several years, and you have all been in, this is the first one where we haven't been asked what is EOSC, so at least there is some progress there. But there is still the question, who is in charge? And we have a structure of committees and we have a structure of guidance here. But I hope that by the end of 2020, we have a clear view of who or what structure is in charge and how it's responsible to the member states and to the European Commission. Because we're putting something here that started as a concept but has to actually be governed as a stream of public and private money working together, and real responsibility and accountability is necessary. So we're here in the Nordic countries where decision-making takes place through a slow process of consensus building, bottom-up and top-down meet. I hope we are in that process now, but I hope a year from now we can come much more clearly with a vision of what the top-down structures will be and what the bottom-up feeding-in mechanisms will be post-2020, because we're starting to get to the point where we need to crystallize the answers to those questions.
Thank you. Actually, you can already hand the mic to Sarah, because we are approaching kind of the end of the panel session, and we started with challenges, and then we have been addressing the key issues to be addressed. But I really want to end this discussion. Thank you all, and end with a positive note. So as a conclusion, could all of you share one opportunity which makes you personally really excited about EOSC?
Yeah, sure. So for me, the thing that actually excites me, but it also really daunts me about EOSC is the scale. Because we heard examples this morning about other initiatives, and comparators are usually in one country or maybe one discipline. And I think it's actually really impressive that we've got so many countries around the table together behind this kind of collective vision. So yeah, what I think is exciting is that if we achieve even only part of what we set out to do and get some agreements and some services functioning and data sharing across those different countries and the respective cultures and the different legislative contexts, and I think we really will have succeeded, not just for Europe, but we'll have kind of paved a set of protocols for the rest of the globe, really, to do that kind of collaboration.
Thank you. Then John.
So for me, data is key, and I hope that's true for this audience too. But the payoff, the success measure, is really big because it's about transforming the way science is done. Science has, for the several hundred years, been measured in terms of publications and journals and access to those publications and journals, and printing and libraries have been key. And the internet has made it possible to electronically access journals much more openly, but they still remain the primary communication mechanism of what we do. And we have the potential now to change that, to make the data that is used the primary communication mechanism. And the challenges that we face, things like climate and the environment and healthcare, really depend upon the data becoming available, because the reproducibility and analysis of those data sets cannot be captured in single journal articles in a sufficient way. So we can do much, much more than just making open access to the outputs of science. We can make open access to the whole process of science if we do this right.
Thank you.
Yeah, my sort of opportunity that I'm looking forward to is very similar to John's, perhaps a little bit more general even than that. The opportunity is to be able to access all the research outputs more quickly without having to wait for papers to be published. Whether this is software, whether it's certainly data, but also software, maybe even just the hypothesis that somebody is working on something, that's already a valuable thing that should be shared. And the methodology they're using should be shared. So all the research outputs much earlier than we currently have, so that we can form new collaborations, so we can reuse the intellectual input that people have put into all the different stages of research more easily. To do this, you're going to need to be able to track credit and give credit where credit is due for all the different intermediaries that are part of the process. And you're also going to have to make sure that where an environment is built where if collaborations are formed and people are working together that don't necessarily associate themselves so tightly as being in the same team, that there's trust and assessment of quality and the like across those broader collaborations. But in short, I'm just looking for everything to be able to happen quicker, because everything is open at every stage, not just after the paper is published.
Thank you.
Opportunities and excitement. I think we are sitting here in an event of the Research Data Alliance. And so having this as such a big crowd that is interested in research data, I think this alone shows what we are aiming at, and that fits into the EOSC mission. And this is also aligned with what we see from the feedback we received on the online survey, so that EOSC should add, in terms of added value, EOSC should be seen and should make it very clear that it makes it easier for the researchers to discover, to access, and to make use of fair research data. And then what really excites me is that we have the opportunity, because this goes across the different scientific disciplines, so we bring together data from from a very broad scope of different disciplines, and have firstly the opportunity to leverage technology such as HPC, artificial intelligence, to work on that data, to attribute, to access those in commercial cloud, and to make sense out of data. And that gives us an unprecedented way of tools to create useful output of that data, work with that data, and to address hopefully the societal challenges that come across in each of the different scientific domains.
Well, I alluded to the opportunities I'm looking for. I have two types of opportunity. As a scientist, emeritus or retired scientist, I'm looking forward to the opportunity to explain to other scientists that I have seen reproducibility of science in action with publication data and software associated. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity to be able to have a variety of success stories in this direction that I will be able to share with my colleague scientists. As a citizen or as a grandpa, I'm more looking for cross-disciplinary examples, being able to explain to my grandchildren that, associating scientific results for various disciplines, we're able to, somebody was able, not me, somebody was able to solve a problem of society. I would be very proud to do that and very happy to do that in front of my grandchildren.
Thank you very much. I really want to thank the distinguished panel members who serve in the executive board and are chairing or co-chairing these working groups. But I also want to use this opportunity to thank all the members in the working groups, because we wouldn't be discussing here the results of their work without the investment of time and energy for this mission. And then I want to thank the audience for all the questions you provided us so that we could have this lively conversation. And next, Sarah will tell what happens after lunch and where should we go. Thank you very much.
And thanks to our chair.
Thank you.